Why don't I start off? I'm Marty Roars. I work for the Sisters of St. Joseph in the Justice Office, and I'm going to be tag teaming with Sister Jane, and she can go next. Whoops, did we, Sister Jane Hurley?
There. Yes. I belong and have belonged to this group from almost the beginning, and it's a wonderful group. Thank you for letting me be part of it.
So we're going to start off with the reflection and prayer, and then that's going to be followed by Sean, who's going to give us some of the broader Christian history.
And my name is Sean Phillips, and I'm the pastoral minister at Getchetoakatiri, and I'm the director of American Indian, the Office of Indian Ministry for the Archdiocese.
And then that's going to be followed by Connie sharing a little bit of Minnesota history. So Connie.
Hi, Connie Bowen, Consociate since 2018 and a member of the Native American Awareness Group.
And that will be followed by Karen.
Hello, my name is Karen Zelesnak, and I'm a Consociate of 2018 also, and a member of the Native American Awareness Working Group.
Who's that?
And we've got a couple of people who have joined our committee and will be supporting us in other ways today. So Rosemary.
Hello, I'm Rosemary Curran, and I'm a Consociate since 2020. Good to be here.
And Marilyn Woolley.
Yourself again.
Hello, I'm a Consociate.
Great. Well, I'm going to mute everyone now, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our reflection. Sister Jane, as I mute everyone, you're going to need to unmute yourself again, okay? All righty, with that, I'm going to bring up our slides for tonight to get us started. And if I can get a thumbs up if you can see the slides. Perfect. All righty, well, we're gonna take you along on our journey. At the last community assembly, we invited everyone to join us in this journey, and the journey that we're calling a journey for truth and healing. And tonight we're gonna spend some time going a little deeper, going into our history of the CSJs and this land that we are presently on. And with that, we're gonna start our land acknowledgement, which we shared an initial draft of this at the community assembly. We've tweaked it a little bit in the last few weeks, but we begin our program this evening with honor and respect for the land and for the first people of this land. Whoops, Jane, you'll have to unmute yourself there.
I can't see.
There you go, Jane.
Okay. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Dakota people.
We desire to honor and respect the First Peoples and recognize their caring for our common home. Other sovereign American Indian nations, including the Anishinaabe, also have a long history, past, present, and future with these sacred lands.
Sean, I think you need to unmute yourself.
We both personally and institutionally continue to have a deepening awareness of our complicity, of the complex history of colonialism, genocide, and broken treaties. We seek to understand the troubled acquisition of this land by unjust US government practices, including the stealing of these lands and the forced removal from the birthplace of the Dakota people without any compensation to the American Indian communities.
We acknowledge the past, current, and future impacts of this history on our relationship with our American Indian sisters and brothers.
In our commitment to social justice and the love of dear neighbor without distinction, we are called to acknowledge and to deepen our understanding of our participation in interlocking systems of oppression.
We seek to journey farther together, to respond boldly in working toward dismantling these systems.
We, St. Catherine University and Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet and Consociates, know that these words are inadequate, imperfect, and must extend beyond this verbal acknowledgement. This is only our beginning of a much larger journey of listening, learning, building relationship, and advocating for and with American Indian nations for a more just world for all.
And now we're going to just share a couple of opening thoughts, reflections, and a little song before we jump into our learnings tonight. So we ground ourselves like we did at the community assembly, that the CSJ charism calls us to love God and love of neighbor without distinction.
The CSJ chapter calls us to go deeper, journey farther, respond boldly, and dare to be prophetic.
Deepening awareness of our complicity and work towards dismantling interlocking systems of oppression.
Because this is who we are.
Every nation come, all my relations under the sun. We are one. We are praying, come. We are praying, come. We are the song and we are the drum. We are one. We are the river, come. We are the river, come. We are the boat, the paddle, the shore. We are one. Many Wachoni sing the Creoles. Many Wachoni sing the Creoles. Many Wachoni, water is life for everything. Oh yes, we are the water, sing the Creoles. We are the water, sing the Creoles. We are the water, we are where all life begins. Oh yes, we are the ancient ones. We are the ancient ones. In your breath and bones we sing on. We are one. We are the meadow, come. We are the meadow, come. We are the lark that sings, a new day has begun. We are the new day, run, run, run. We are the new day, run, run, run. We are the old and we are the young. We are one. Many Wachoni sing the Creoles. Many Wachoni sing the Creoles. Many Wachoni, water is life for everything. Oh yes, we are the water, sing the Creoles. are the water, Saint. We are the water, we are where all life begins. Oh yes, we are the earth and sky. We are the thunder cries. We are the fire. We are the light in your eyes. We are standing strong, like a rock, like a stone, on the sacred ground we belong. We are home. All my relations come, every nation come, all my relations under the sun. We are one.
Okay, Sean, we'll invite you to help us with some background information on Christian theology and our history.
As I watched the reflection, I was struck that not everybody is still with us today in some of those pictures. And that was sad. Let us remember those that have continued the fight. So where do we begin? Our beginnings are with the church. Around 300, the church changed its structure when Constantine chose to call himself Christian. It appears that his consolidating of secular and Christian power grew both of our entities. But many feel that this is what started the church's participation in colonization. This was a feudal structure and soon became the Holy Roman Empire. Maybe one of our earlier oxymorons. The church adopted the civil hierarchy to become the official hierarchy of the church. This developed a feudal hierarchy within the church that is still present today. This created the church becoming the only international arbiter between nations, Christian nations, and individual proclamations to navigate this time. These countries began expanding their influence, and the popes of the middle 1400s tried to keep Europe out of war by litigating worldwide exploration, domination with the Doctrine of Discovery. The first of those was in 1452, the Dum Diversas. This gave us a kind of short and quick way to allow slavery, especially in Africa at that particular time. Just after that, then in 1455 came the Romanus Pontifex, which extended to all Christian nations dominion over seized lands and slavery for non-Christian people. This slide went on to kind of identify all of the things and who is a pagan and who is a Saracen and all of that. And we'll get into this a little bit. But this is the next document that was done. And then the last document was Inter Cartera in 1493. And one Christian nation could not take dominion over land that had been claimed by another Christian nation. And then our last Doctrine of Discovery was the Terra Nullius, which was the unoccupied land. And they tried to claim that for Australia, but that was not true. And thus far, we haven't found unoccupied land. But this really became the scramble for empire at that time. The next slide, please. In which the Christian nations began visiting Africa and the Western Hemisphere and Asia. And the church became kind of the arbitrary in trying to minimize the damage to Europe. And so this scramble for empire became a proxy war for Europe. It didn't always work because there was war in Europe off and on for the next couple hundred years. The Catholic Church at that time was entering the Spanish Inquisition, which also targeted the Saracens, the Jews, indigenous people with forced conversion. Women as well suffered during this time, especially those with knowledge of healing and local plants, herbs, medicine, and the like. So the Doctrine of Discovery is one kind of issue that has been brought up. And the other one are these three terms: manifest destiny, eminent domain, and divinely chosen. And these last three came into being through the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther posted his 95 Thesis in 1517. And that began a conversation beginning belief and practice of the church, which was the beginning of the Reformation. Others entered the conversation: Jean Calvin, Zwingli, Henry VIII, John Knox, creating conflict with Catholics and with one another. People fled the Reformation because they felt they would be destroyed. The new land became a place to go. And the Catholic Church responded during this period with the Counter-Reformation and the formation of the Society of Jesuits to counteract some of the things in which the Reformation, the church found out, had some truth that needed to change the church. And Jesuits were given some of that responsibility. Most of the first groups to land in what is now the United States were Protestants, either leaving Catholic countries or disagreeing with the Protestant governments, so that within a few years, the colonies were Protestant, surrounded by land claimed by Catholic countries. And the New World became a proxy Reformation. Next slide, please. So this is the Doctrine of Discovery brought us to the shore. And then these next terms really came out of the Reformation and came out later. So that we have the United States here, but north is France, as well as to the west of the colonies. South and west was also Spanish territory, surrounded. So we have a Protestant nation between two Catholic nations. And that only intensified because of the Reformation, all of these things between the churches. The Protestant Reformation brought these new ideas: education, reading in your own language, loosening of banking practice, capitalism, democracy, anti-clericalism, separation of church and state, manifest destiny, imminent domain, and the gospel of success. And of course, they developed enemies against one another together. Not just the Protestants, Catholics developed their own enemies too. The representatives of the colonizing nations invited sovereign Indian nations to form treaties with the English. The French in the north formed treaties with indigenous people as well, and so did the colonists. And so the American Indian sovereign nations adopted the rationale of the country that they made agreements with. So in some ways, by the time the Pilgrims got here, everybody was colonizing the Western Hemisphere, especially the United States and Canada. Well, while the Doctrine of Discovery was used against to justify ownership of the land, it was also used later on after the United States formed as a legal precedent in Supreme Court law. And that Supreme Court law continues on the docks today, but the church technically has rescinded the Doctrine of Discovery. Rerum Novarum came in 1891 and began a history of the church's social teaching, which started coming into play throughout our history. And then a new book came out of that, the Code of Canon Law, which replaced the Corpus Juris Canonici, or the corpus of canon law that was there. So the application of the new Code of Canon Law rescinded all previous laws, which would include the papal bulls for the Doctrine of Discovery. Later on, the current, or that particular Code of Canon Law was replaced in 1983. And so that Code of Canon Law has been rescinded, and we have a new one today, which does not include the Doctrine of Discovery. The Reformation impacted the colonists in lots of ways. The Reformation inspired missionaries and religious refugees to come to America, augmented a rivalry with Spain that inspired England to claim Virginia, and inspired Calvinists to settle New England. Protestants also put a premium on earning worldly wealth, dovetailing their religious motivations to colonize with the economic motivations currently in play. American colonists were familiar with the English Civil War and the French Civil War, in which Protestant Republicans rose up and challenged monarchies, laying a foundation for the American Revolution and anti-Catholic feelings still felt today. The Christian Church during the formation of the United States and Canada sometimes were advocates for American Indian people and sometimes continued perpetuating the genocide of colonization, which was begun. The proxy Reformation continues today as we hear different things about, is he Catholic enough or is he not Catholic enough as our president of the United States? This last one is the process of decolonization. The very base of our government is layered with racism, genocide, and supported by Protestant and Catholic denominations, done in the name of domination, power, and control. The question is how do we enter into truth and healing for all, even though the foundations of our church and government are filled with much evil? How do we decolonize?
This next section, I'm going to be speaking about Minnesota history, and we will have a short time for questions and reflection after, so for Sean and myself afterwards. So learning more about the history of the land and the people has been a really deep dive for me personally this past month or so, especially. The need for this study really, really resonates with me. But it seems really disrespectful to try to condense such a complex history into my 10 minutes. So I would like to really invite and warmly welcome our community to further study of the history of the land and the history of the people. Together we could read, talk to experts and local historians, and talk to Dakota people. So it's really not enough for you to get sufficient for you to get Connie's version of Minnesota history from a New Yorker, no less. So we will be also presenting, there'll be a list of resources at the end that would be available for people. And one of them is this book, which is a good resource, The Land of the Dakota, Minnesota Makoche. This is by Gwen Westerman, who's a poet and a historian in Mankato, a professor, and Bruce White, local historian. So this tells the 300-year history leading, before 1862. So they're pointing out, no, the Dakota history did not start nor end with the 1862, 1863 events. So, and as Karen pointed out to me earlier in the day, Connie, these historians are alive. We can talk to these people. So the next slide shows the treaties involved in Minnesota. Where the Ojibwe and the Dakota ceded their land. And I'm going to be focusing down on the area in around the Twin Cities, that 1851 area there, but the area of the Twin Cities and the Bdote, which would be the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, which in Dakota culture is the Bdote there is that's where the creation story starts. So this is very sacred land. And you're going to notice on there is no 1805 Zebulon Pike Treaty. So the next slide is a timeline. But as I said, this is, I hesitate to look disrespectful of how complex everything really is. But in 1805, Zebulon Pike had a conversation and he had an agreement which was never called a treaty. In 1805, there was an agreement with General Pike, but there were no witnesses. This was never considered binding by the Native peoples. They did not have that concept of giving the land to the white people. And this, the 1805 discussion was so that, of course, Fort Snelling could be constructed right on the site of the Bdote. 14 years later, the U.S. they built the building of Fort Snelling, and in 42, this 1805 area did include most of the St. Paul and Minneapolis territories. So in 1842, you can see that the Dakota are being pushed off of the lands that we're talking about in St. Paul. And 1849, Minnesota becomes a territory. 1851 is the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, which is millions and millions of acres, which I don't have time tonight, but this treaty was considered unhonorable just by the natives and by also many white people. There was duplicity, misinformation, deception, outright deception involved in the signing of the Traverse des Sioux Treaty. In 1851, also the first four sisters of St. Joseph arrived in St. Paul in responding to a call to come, which Marty will speak more of from Michelle's research. And in 1855, the land that we're speaking of, where the Sisters of St. Joseph and St. Catherine campuses that was purchased by the future Minnesota State Governor William Marshall. But this did not include any compensation to the Native communities. The next slide has the parcel. Oh, okay. I thought I had William Marshall's parcel with our campus on there. But so in 1858, the Minnesota became a state. 1861, we have the Civil War. 1862, the Dakota War, U.S. Dakota War. I feel terrible skipping over some of these details, but we don't have a lot of time. In 1863, after the U.S. Dakota War, Congress passed an act that abrogated and annulled all treaties with the Dakota people, which I found so shocking, that all lands held by the Dakota and all annuities due to them were forfeited to the US government. In March of 63, the Dakota people from Minnesota, there was exiling, and that law is still in effect today. And in 63, in May, the Fort Snelling prisoners who were remaining, there were 1,600 prisoners down on the Pike Island there, and over 300 perished during that rough winter. So this officially was called the Act for the Removal of the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Mdewakanton, and Wapakuta bands of Sioux or Dakota Indians, and that was for the removal and the dispositions of their lands in Minnesota and the Dakotas. So the next slide has, I believe, yeah, we lost William Marshall, Marty. So this is the Dakota picture tells 1,000 words. This is the prisoners, Dakota prisoners on Pike Island below Fort Snelling. Let's think about where this is, though, because I just mentioned that the Dakota creation story starts right there, right where they are. And the Dakota were incarcerated in a very sacred land. Women would travel to give birth there, and that is their creation spot. And here they were held as prisoners. The next slide is a picture from 1863 of Bishop Whipple. Bishop Whipple visited the Dakota prisoners on Pike Island there, and he worked to convert them to Christianity. And this is from the Dakota War site of the Minnesota Historical Society. So I include this picture because those pictures are out there. What I mean is that when we're talking about our complex history, we also want to talk about other people's perceptions of our history. So the Native people might obviously generalize to priests in general, or Catholics in general, or the sisters in general. They're not going, we're looking into the details of our history, but they're not going to make the distinction of what one branch of sisters did versus another. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we talk about how things are perceived. The next slide tragically is the Minnesota. It's the Mankato 38 who were hanged the day after Christmas in 1862, which was the largest mass execution in US history. There were over 300 Dakota that were convicted, and as people know, likely Lincoln pardoned, commuted over 264 cases, but I mean, they still had 39, and Sibley thought one might not be guilty, so they hung 38, and then later two more were executed. And then the next slide is coming back to the encampment, the internment there of the Dakota people on their own sacred land. When the federal exile of the Dakota people is still on the books. So that hasn't been repealed. And the Dakota, this isn't something that's just history. This is something that they're living with in the here and now. And we are living with this too. I mean, think about what we were taught in school, where there's this disconnect between what we were taught about the inevitable westward expansion of an unoccupied frontier of our country versus what actually happened with the land and the people involved. This affects us too. What are we carrying in our white bodies? For those of us who have read My Grandmother's Hands, I mean, think about, we're living this too. And that is.
Yeah, before we go into some of the specifics around the CSJ history with this land, we just wanted to have a pause. If there's any questions, comments, or clarifications, we'll take just a couple of minutes for Sean or Connie if you want to raise your hand, and we'll try and call on you to add a comment. And
yes, insights in addition to questions are welcome.
Yes, insights, other comments. I will stop sharing the screen for a moment so we can see folks. There's the raise your hand button on the bottom of the screen, or just physically wave your hand if you want to.
Looks like Florence has a question.
Go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay. You spoke about the law that's still in effect. Have there been attempts to repeal that?
We'll talk about that a little later in the program. There have been attempts that we just really have not gone anywhere. So one of the things we're hoping to do as a CSJ community is maybe meet with some of our congressional people to restart the conversation and see what could be reconsidered. But we'll talk a little more about that later, Florence.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other insights? Many of you might be way further ahead than I in this journey.
Mary Ellen had a question.
Mary Ellen, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Actually, comments. The treaties, we follow them when they serve us, and we don't follow them when they don't serve us. So the treaties, the struggle is for the government to be faithful to the treaties in many cases, as far as the hunting and fishing, so many of the things that we want to just bypass. So the treaties are so problematic because we decide where they're going to be followed and where they're not. I mean, the privileged white society.
Yes, no treaty has remained unbroken.
Right.
One more thought or comment before we move a little into the CSJ history?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment. I mean, part of my not being able to use my words is just how overwhelming it is and how disturbing it is. And we kind of know a little bit, or, there was that PBS special about the woman whose last name was Davern, and she discovered, the relationship her great-grandfather had with Pike Island. I mean, it's really important stuff. It is part of doing our own work as we walk on this very land. So thank you for presenting this.
I completely agree, Christine. I was going to say that too. It's overwhelming. So I think the silence is just people trying to take it into ourselves, into our bodies. It's just a lot.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to kind of pause and I mean, as Connie says, we can't do justice in 10 minutes, but hopefully it gets us thinking, talking as a CSJ community, having conversations, not only amongst ourselves, but many of the folks who have written many of these extensive histories are still alive. And a part of it is trying to do our own research. And so the next part, we wanted to take a little look at least what we know about the CSJ history with this particular land. We were hoping that Michelle Hugh, the CSJ archivist and consociate, would be with us tonight, and it just things just did not work out last minute. So I am going to step in and work from her notes and from some of the conversations we've had with her over the last 2 years, and I will try and piece to the best of my ability. There's things that we know, and there's a lot of what we don't know. We're trying to piece together the best of what we know. The three main areas or questions that seem to come up now and again that we want to at least try and cover in this short section is to look at a little bit about the land and the history of the Sisters / St. Kate's. The coming to this land, there has been questions about a native trail going through campus that have arisen over the past number of years in particular, and probably longer. There's continual questions around boarding schools in the CSJs, and then the history of orphanages in the CSJs. And so that's the main areas we're going to just try and quickly touch base on. And again, we'll have a kind of a Q&A conversation time dialogue, because there are clearly sisters and probably consociates on this Zoom call that know a lot more about the history than I probably do, but I'm trying to work off of Michelle Hugh's notes. So the first thing she wanted us to realize is that the sisters were requested by Bishop Cretin to come to Minnesota to open a Catholic school for girls in July of 1851, and the sisters came in the fall of 1851 and first settled here. Again, they were brought here to open a school for girls. We have to realize that there was already a St. Paul Public School that was established by Harriet Bishop in 1847, and so it was not the first school in the area, but this was the invitation again from the Catholic Bishop Cretin. Questions when we look at the land that we are currently on here with the CSJ community, with St. Kate's and with Carondelet Village in particular. So Randolph, Cleveland, this area, some of the land seems to have been donated to the sisters, and some of the land was purchased. And so even with this section of land that we're on, there's mixed pieces in terms of whether it was donated or was purchased by the sisters. We'll show you a few maps that seem to indicate that the land was either a reserve park or farmland just prior to the sisters coming to this particular piece of land that the community resides on now. And it does appear just prior to the sisters coming and acquiring or being on this main piece of land here with the university, it was previously owned by Albert Lee College for Women. And their intent was to open a college here in St. Paul to be closer to McAllister College, because this Albert Lee College for Women was started by a Presbyterian minister, and that ended up not happening. And so the Albert Lee College sold a piece of the land to the CSJs in about 1901 or 2, from what Michelle Hugh can tell. A general map from around this time just kind of lists this area as reserve. There's not a lot of markings, and we'll zoom in on a particular map that we have an actual date on. This is in 1886. So again, if the sisters acquired a piece of this land in about 1901, but this kind of gives you the area. You see big chunks of land by Peter Boland, so Boland Avenue, that many of the street names, but they're just kind of large sections of what looked like kind of farmland. In 1887, if you look in a little closer at the piece of land that the college and Carondelet Village are on, there's this section of land that says Reserve Park Garden Lots. So they were beginning to kind of divide up some of these larger sections in about 1887. And we'll give you the links and resources to look at this and go into more depth. And this is, again, if the sisters bought the land in about 1901-02, this is a map of the grounds of the College of St. Catherine on a map from 1905. It's kind of a blank area with not a lot of detail, but you can kind of see the community around it. So very different from the previous map that I showed you in the 1860s or 1880s. So, you know, realistically 20, 25 years. There has been questions or around what was called the native trail that went through campus. And again, if you go back to this map, not a lot of detail in 1905 of the area there of the land. But that's the time that the sisters came to this particular piece of land to start the college. Where would the trail have been in 1901-02? Again, we're going off of a 1905 map, but the question keeps coming up. In the 1970s, there were articles in Stories in St. Kate's about bent willows on campus marking this native trail through campus. I see some sisters nodding their heads. I'm assuming that means they have heard these stories as well or have shared these stories. The question becomes, most willow trees live for an average of 30 to 50 years. So if in the 1970s you had willow trees, even if you went back 50 years, that's the 1920s. Okay, so just questions. We don't have answers. There's questions and answers. This map was an indication of where these willow trees were on campus. But again, how far do they go back? And then Michelle Hugh had been doing some research. This is a photo. The photo is dated 1905. She has some questions about, is it exactly 1905, but we can assume it's around 1905 when Durham Hall was built. It was listed as the Native American Trail on campus, seen in the photo of Durham Hall. And you see this kind of footpath in front of Durham Hall. Michelle Hugh humbly asks the question, the trail appears to come from the bottom of the steps on the south side of Durham Hall and follows a path to what we now know as Dewdrop Pond. Michelle simply asked the questions, I don't know when the pond appeared or was named on campus, but could this just been a walking path for workers who were building Durham Hall or early students going down to Dewdrop Pond? Or is it this Native American trail? We're going to present questions and answers. And this is, again, Michelle Hugh is willing to talk to people afterwards as well, but we're just sharing what she knows. She said, according to the Highland Project, she's had a long conversation with members of this group this last summer. There may have been a Native American trail that would have followed maybe Snelling Avenue a mile north of campus, which would have been a more direct route down to the river and to the Pike Island area. On older maps, you'll see that some of them are listed as government Indian trails down to the river. And again, so it's question, are these some of the main roads? Or, and again, Michelle wants us all to be clear. We know we are on native land. There's no question that they walked and roamed and lived here and cared for this land. It's just trying to answer this question around the native trail. So this is again from Michelle Hugh. She says it's likely a trail made by workers, students, maybe staff going down to the lagoon or the dewdrop that it's called now. And again, just wondering about, according to the research of the Highland Project, about Snelling Avenue. So just questions that Michelle raises for us to think about. Questions continue to surface regarding boarding schools. And so Michelle encourages us to make the distinction to think about boarders at a school versus a boarding school, because many of our schools were day schools, but they may have had some boarders. But the three main schools she invites us to look at in the early days of the CSJs were St. Joe's Academy, the first school, had day students as well as a few boarders. So it was not a boarding school, but there were a few boarders at St. Joe's Academy. She says that St. Joseph Academy opened in November of 1851, so when the sisters first arrived here to teach girls. The boys were being taught at the new cathedral. There were day students as well as a few boarders. The boarders were students who lived too far from the city to walk to school daily. There doesn't seem to be any indications, at least in Michelle's research at this time, that there were native students at the school. The second school is Long Prairie, or the Long Prairie Mission. Sisters were sent to teach both children and adults at Long Prairie. The Winnebago or Ho-Chunk Indians had been moved from Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, to Long Prairie to be a peaceful group between the Dakota and the Ojibwe tribes. Sisters taught there until 1855. She does not have a date when they first went, but realistically sometime between 1851 and 1855. So they were only there a couple of years when the government then moved the Winnebago to Blue Earth, Minnesota. And so that ended the sisters there. Again, it was not simply a school, from my understanding, for the Winnebago. They were some of the students in the school, is my understanding. The third school she brings up is St. Mary's School, or Our Lady of the Lake Convent School in Graceville, Minnesota. It opened to educate children in the west central part of Minnesota. They were day students and some boarders. The some boarders were girls, and there seem to be indications that some of these girls were from the Sisseton, Wahpeton Sioux tribe at the Lake Travis Reservation in South Dakota. From what Michelle's research reveals, that there seems to have been 8 students in 1885, the first year that the sisters were there and opened the school. There seems to be in up to 25 students by 1896. And then the government did provide some funding until 1896. There seems to be some indication that Chief Gabriel Renville was a mixed blood of Dakota, French, and Scottish backgrounds. He seemed to have had some influence as the chief to encourage some, or to bring some of the native girls to the school. And then the government funding discontinued. Sisters including M. Seraphine Ireland went by wagon to pick up the girls and to bring them home at the end of every term. So that's from some of the notes that Michelle had. So those seem to be the three schools that give us kind of a sense of the early schools of the sisters. And clearly there would have been some Native students. It appears to be a few Native girls in particular at some of these schools. But these schools, again, were primarily day schools. So not the classic boarding schools that we often think about when we think about Native boarding schools. And the third part of this section is just looking at Catholic orphanages. So the question comes up regarding Catholic orphanages in the CSJ community. So again, from Michelle's research, the St. Paul Catholic Orphanage for both boys and girls was first opened at St. Joseph Hospital. In 1878, the boys were moved to St. Anthony's in Minneapolis, and the girls to a home on Carroll Avenue in St. Paul. The Catholic Boys Home, in 1878, no, I just said that. So, and then there's the Catholic Boys Home, which was opened in St. Anthony in Minneapolis at Immaculate Conception Parish, in the Winslow House, and then the Sisters of St. Joseph were asked to help staff that. And then in 1885/86, that's when it was moved. The boys' home was moved to 46th and Chicago Avenue in South Minneapolis. At that time, according to Michelle, it was called the St. Joseph German Orphanage, or what was the beginning of the Catholic Charities that we are familiar with today. It was staffed by the Sisters of St. Benedict and was located on Randolph Avenue at Warwick, close to Holy Spirit Church. And then in the 1960s, the Catholic Boys Home and then the St. Joseph's Home were merged into one at the Minneapolis location that we currently think of when we think of as St. Joseph's Home. Or the Sisters of St. Joseph left the ministry following this merger, and it was the Sisters of St. Benedict who continued to staff the home in cooperation with Catholic Charities. And from Michelle's research, that's when they began to call it St. Joseph's or St. Joe's, after the Sisters of St. Joseph left the ministry. Okay, so we're going to pause here and stop sharing screen again. To the best of my ability, I'm no Michelle Hugh, but I'm trying to share what she has shared with us as a committee group. We're not experts, but again, we want to start the dialogue conversation. Thoughts, comments from the group. And if you want to just wave your hand, or
Florence has a question.
Florence, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Back to the first school we opened in that log cabin, I was under the impression that that was for Native children, American Indians. We just had a school for girls. That's what I thought I remembered from our history. Anybody else remember? Were you there then?
Yes, but not only that, but it included children of, especially there was a couple chiefs, daughters were sent there, but I didn't ever understand that it was exclusively for Natives. It was a concession we were fooled. The sisters came from France and wanted to teach the Indians, and Cretan wanted them to come up to start a regular school. And so he went down there, and the bishop down there said, just tell them that they're going to be able to teach Indians and they'll come. And so that's what he did. So they came up with the understanding that they were going to be teaching the Indians. So he got a few of the chiefs to bring their daughters there to sort of satisfy the promise that they would teach the Indians. And Sister Scholastica, in the meantime, was upset about it, and she went to Long Prairie to teach the Indians there. That's what I understood from the history. And after the cholera, in the opening of St. Joseph's Hospital, after the cholera, there were no more Native children in the school. It was all just settlers.
Yeah, according again to Michelle's notes, the school in Long Prairie in 1855, that's when the government moved the Winnebago, so they were no longer in the school there in Long Prairie. A lot of those notes, from my understanding, were destroyed. I think it was with the death of Bishop Cretin. And so that was a part of what his will said. And so we don't have a lot of records, according to Michelle. But it was not a school, from my understanding from Michelle, only for Native children. It was a day school for any children, but clearly there were some students who were Native American day students from the Winnebago tribe.
Sean?
So my question is, can we look at this sister's record of where she was? And did she actually go from Long Prairie to Prairie du Chien? And if that's the case, there was a choice that she went to work with the tribal group. So that would be a connection that the sisters have.
And Carolyn had a question.
Just a comment that I'm kind of disappointed that all the stories I heard about the bent willow on the campus down by the dewdrop, that isn't really able to be traced back to the Indian path. So I'm a little disheartened by that it turns out to be not enough time that the willows die before that would have happened. So sorry. Did anybody else learn that? No.
Well, again,
Okay.
Carolyn, we're just asking the questions. We don't know, but that's what we are, and trying to look at the maps. I think I see Bridget's hands there as well.
No.
Thanks, Marty. I just had a question about the orphanages in particular. Was that research done knowing that there were likely Native children at the orphanages, or like, I'm just curious about the specific exploration of orphanages?
I think the question keeps coming up regarding orphanages and Native children. Again, there aren't a lot of records, but the school was initially, or the orphanage was initially called the St. Joseph's German Orphanage. I think we know we'll just say there's just questions. And again, I don't think there's a lot that we know who were the students at the orphanages.
And I think I had some questions about orphanages as well, because initially when the boarding schools were started, the government took all the children from Native families and sent them to boarding school. But that began to change later in the 20th century. So they no longer forced them to go to boarding school, but they took their children away because they were in poverty. And so then they went to orphanages, or they were assigned to other places. And that continued until fairly recently, in which natives supervise all native adoption process and whatnot. But there's a lot of adoption, foster care, horrors for us to look at if we wish. I did learn something else for myself in watching this again, is I got to thinking that time period between in the early 1900s was also, I think, of Last of the Mohican came out of there, and a whole genre of noble savage, which was between 1900 and probably the early 20s. We had this. Well, we still have some of that today, and whatnot. And I can remember doing camps and whatnot in which some of these noble savage stories we would do to teach people about something, but they really weren't true. They were, we made them up. So I can remember a camp where we had the story like the Dewdrop Pond, or a story like this is an ancient, no truth to it at all. But it was something that, you used to scare freshman students, or pass on something, or just a thought. I don't know if any of that's true, but that whole noble savage, those stories sound like noble savage stories to me.
And Kate had her hand up.
Yeah, it was kind of a question that goes between Connie's and, among all of the different presentations, thinking of 1851, when that treaty, the 1851 treaty was signed, and when the sisters came in 1851, is there any information about what, if anything, the sisters may have known about some of the I think you were talking about some improprieties around that particular treaty, and even if they didn't know it quite then, did they learn about it later?
Yeah, I know.
I don't. In the Minnesota Makoche book, they unearthed treaties and a Dakota copy of the Traverse to Sioux Treaty that had never been seen before and never studied before. And they look at the language and the translations in French and English and Dakota and saw the outright lies and misinformation. So I would have to suspect, I don't think so, that they would know.
Rita has her hand up.
I thought when we were focusing once upon a time on the origins of St. Joseph's Hospital, I had the idea that the sisters came thinking they were going to teach, and they were in that one room log cabin with the mud all around, and had to go up onto the second floor to escape the floods. But almost within the year, the illness, the sickness pandemic came, and they gave up their schooling work because they were bringing them patients. People were being taken care of who were sick, and they didn't have the time to be teaching. And I thought that was in quite a short proximity, but that doesn't seem to be what the St. Joseph Academy history is, or I don't know. What do you remember?
I thought you have to know when the cholera epidemic hit. And I thought it was within like 3 or 4 years after they came, but I don't know that I know the exact date. But that's the information I remember, is that it began as a school and then went to the cholera epidemic.
Sorry about that. I was trying to put up the timeline there for you all, and that wasn't working. Again, it's trying to piece it together. But if they came in 1851, the cholera break, from my understanding, was 1853.
Okay.
So we're not trying to say we have the definitive answers. We are trying to piece together as well. And I think that's the conversation.
And then there was no mention of Hugh Derham, for whom the building was named because he gave that plot of land because he wanted his daughters educated. And we have, in fact, one of his grand or great granddaughters who's been on the board at St. Kate's, and you know, she's isn't she a McHugh? So that wasn't mentioned in the history of that, the 1900, because that would have been 1904, 1905, when Durham Hall was a college preparatory and then the first college class.
Yeah, so we'll loop back to this at the end. And Michelle Hugh apologizes for not being able to be with us tonight, but she is open to people having conversations, questions with her to go a little deeper on some of the specifics. So again, I think we as a little subcommittee are trying to share what she has shared with us and what we have learned in the process ourselves. So with that, we're going to transition a little. We're not trying to end the conversation. It continues, but we want to give some time for some small groups. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen to help lead us into the next part of our conversation tonight.
Okay. Well, thank you, Marty. You know, this whole now past an hour, we've just been giving you information and a lot of, we don't know, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. But let's just take a moment now to for a little bit longer pause. And we're just going to pull up a picture, a beautiful picture with some sounds of water and birds. And I would just invite you just to pause for a moment and just enjoy that. And then we'll come back in about 30 seconds. Well, I hope that that was a refreshing moment for folks. I hadn't even thought about lying in that creek with all the heat going on. So then this next picture, and Marty, if you want to go on to the next slide. Some of you may remember this picture because you saw it if you were at the community assembly. And it's coming. What is it? It's the picture of the, yes, it's the web. And this picture, I'm using it today as a reminder that our journey is not a straight line. That it indeed, if you look at the very center, it starts out as a spiral and it becomes a web with many connections. And even you can see from our conversation tonight, this is just like a web of information trying to piece things together. And as part of this journey for seeking truth and healing in this time and in this place, we're now starting on the part of the journey that will help us to bring alive the words that we spoke at the very beginning, the words of the land acknowledgement, with some actions and practices. And Marty, if you want to go on to the next slide. And this is our invitation to you to come walk with us. To pray and discern, and maybe to struggle with this, what do we do next? Or how do we make these words come alive? And so that's our job right now, is to start thinking about this. And when the time is right, we will want to share these ideas, these actions, these practices with tribal members and to have conversation and discussion and some feedback. But right now, this is where we are, starting with some possible categories of actions and practices. It's a place to start, but not a place to end. So we've got there at the very beginning, prayer and discernment, to always begin with that and to have that with us at all times. building relationships with American Indian communities, organizations, nonprofits, businesses. What collaborations might we have with St. Kate's? Researching our own colonizing past, our own history of our families. Potentially host a listening session on boarding schools. And then reparations and restitutions. And in a moment, we'll be putting you into small breakout rooms, and we are asking that you provide some feedback on these, on the things that are on this list. Add to, and you can maybe also think about a continuum of actions. Maybe something that individuals can do. And maybe some of the things that you might commit to doing right now. So individual actions, actions that the community can take, and actions that can lead to systemic changes. It's just like we were talking about the law that's still on the books. So we're going to try and put this list into chat, but I'm hoping that you can remember some of those things. So again, they were prayer and discernment, building relationships with Native communities and businesses, and wow, I can't remember the other ones. Let's see. Got those, Marty? Well, we're going to try and get them into the chat room. But you're going to have, so we would like just some feedback from you if you want to add to that list, feedback on anything that's there, and just start the conversation. And I would remind you just, you know the chapter, the breakout room drill, introduce yourselves if you don't know each other. And then we would like you to designate a scribe, because we would like to actually get these ideas back from you. So a scribe, introduce yourselves, and then at the very end, just be prepared to email your list off either tonight or tomorrow.
Well, welcome back, everyone. As you're all coming back, we apologize in advance. We know that there was not enough time there again, but we do know that this is only a beginning of a conversation that we are hoping will continue in the community.
Well, can I say, I got cut off in the middle of giving a resource to somebody?
Sure, go ahead, Sean.
So we were talking about the books 1491 and 1493, written by Charles C. Mann, M-A-N-N. That gives us a pre-Columbian, post-Columbian view of the Western Hemisphere.
And in addition to that particular book, there is a resource sheet that you can pick up from some of the suggestions that Connie has gathered, some things from Michelle Hugh. Handouts of that resource sheet can be found at Joan Whitman's door in Carondelet Village. And for anyone else, you can reach out to me if you would like to obtain the resource sheet. But we encourage, if there was a scribe in your group, to share some of the feedback, ideas, things you came up with initially in your group. Send that to myself in the Justice Office, and I will kind of try and collate some of that and find a way to share that, especially with the subcommittee. And with that, we know we're pushing up on 8 o'clock, but we have a few other next steps, ideas, thoughts we want to leave you with this evening. Again, how do we look at ongoing prayer and discernment as we identify actions and practices to accompany this education and land acknowledgement, so it goes beyond that? Ongoing CSJ community conversations. How do we keep this conversation going beyond tonight and with others who weren't here tonight? We're hoping to bring back in the fall and request of the community assembly to move through the community assembly process, which we know is usually a two-time process with the community assembly process, but looking for a formal endorsement of a land acknowledgement. And then we hope to continue to find ways to build relationships with Native communities and organizations and businesses. And we also want to go back to Sister Florence, helped us to ask the question, well, what's being done about this law from 1863 that officially exiles all Dakota people from this land we call Minnesota? There has been attempts at the state legislature to try and revoke this law, but it's a federal law and it went nowhere and didn't really have the jurisdiction. And to the best of our understanding, there has not really been any federal efforts because, one, there are very few Native people in Washington, and two, we only have 8 people in Congress from Minnesota. And so where do you get the impetus? But we're going to have a conversation with Betty McCollum's chief of staff in 2 weeks from tonight. Just to start this conversation, Betty McCollum used to sit on the Native American Affairs Committee for Congress. And so we're hoping she and her staffers might have some ideas, and maybe the CSJ community can help encourage a broader community conversation. So if you want to be a part of that, contact the office, reach out, or watch for rapid relays that will be forthcoming. And then there's summer gardening volunteer activities that the Native American Awareness Group does with Dream of Wild Health. If you want to join us for one of those trips, you're welcome to join a Native American Awareness Working Group meeting to continue the conversation. We're continuing to look at ways we can engage and work with Native American alumni from St. Kate's. And then continue to share resources, add to the list that's outside of Joan Whitman's door, and let's continue the conversation in our community. And with that, we thank you all for coming tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to Karen to kind of wrap us up and give us a little closing officially.
Right. This is a poem or an excerpt of a poem by Charlotte Tall Mountain of the Iroquois Native American heritage, and this is For the Love of the World.
Karen?
Yes.
Can anybody that's presenting please stay a little longer afterwards?
Oh, sure. Okay, so from Charlotte. For the love of a tree, she went out on a limb. For the love of the sea, she rocked the boat. And for the love of the earth, she dug deeper. And so from some parting words, going back to the beginning, go deeper, journey farther, respond boldly, and dare to be prophetic. Words that I think Charlotte Tall Mountain would appreciate. Thanks for coming.